Thank you, Russ, and thank you all for having me. Can everybody hear me? Is this all right? Okay. So I have to start off with a couple of just introductory remarks and a couple of caveats. I think I would be remiss as the dean of a business school on a development trip in front of a bunch of people who are media savvy if I didn't actually take a few seconds to just tell you who we are and what we're doing in the business school, and then I'll jump right into the topic of today. So for those of you who don't know, the George Washington School of Business is part of George Washington University. It sits in Foggy Bottom, about 6 blocks from the White House and across the bank from the IMF and the IFC. And it's a really interesting and fascinating time to be in Washington right now thinking about issues of business. I actually came from the Stern School of Business. I spent 13 years of my career at NYU. And I'm part of, or enjoying the experience of building a new kind of business school and really thinking about business education in a fundamentally different way. Business education, as many of you must know, is in a little bit of a crisis. We had followed for about 30 years the notions that were put forth first by Milton Friedman in 1970 that business schools and business education should really only be thinking about shareholder value. There's really nothing else that we need to think about. Let the advocacy organizations and everybody else think about what it is that society cares about, and let's just let markets run their course. And of course, this was a very bad decision in my view. And as a sociologist by training, my work has always been about China primarily, but also about the notion that business is fundamentally embedded in social and political systems. Now, the 2000-2001 accounting crisis made us think about that a little bit, but we still couldn't really get our minds around what to do about it. And then, of course, with the economic crisis starting in 2007-2008, there were some of us that were really starting to wonder whether or not we're doing our jobs in business education. And so the George Washington School of Business actually went out and tried to find somebody who would help rethink what it means to be a business school in thinking about the embeddedness of business in society. And what better place to build a school like that than 6 blocks from the White House of the nation's capital, of the largest economy in the world, and all of the ways that we think about the possibility of building something around the intersection of business and public policy. Of course, we have great interests in international ethics and sustainability and leadership. And of course, because I'm a China hand, we are going to be spending more and more time and building a bigger presence for George Washington University here in my what I think of as Wulaojia, because I lived in Shanghai in 1994, 95, 96, and it was I would just be sad if we didn't actually make this a fundamental part of what we're going to be doing. So that's my kind of basic overview of who we are and where we're going. I want to jump into the substance of what I was asked to talk about today. Now I need to give a couple of caveats here. I am an old China hand and would consider myself perhaps even a China expert in some areas, particularly in the economic reform. I am not, I hate to say, for those of you who thought you were coming to hear an expert on social media, I'm not an expert on social media. I'm sure some of you in this room know more about social media than I do, and I don't even have a Facebook page, which my PR team has been telling me is just wrong and they're going to do something about very soon. But I actually do have a group of people that I collaborate with who are the digital IQ side of what I do, and I bring the China and also the public sector expertise. And we've kind of built a little bit of a presence in both thinking about China and thinking about the digital space of governmental organizations. And so these things are kind of all converging today, and so we thought we might put together a little talk to think about these issues. Now, taking a step back, I want to go back to 1994. So 1994, I was a PhD student living in Shanghai, riding a little one-speed bike around the factory managers to understand the transformation of state-owned organizations. The work that I was doing then was a little bit sensitive because I didn't want officials and chaperones following me around, so I was just making all these interviews myself. And it concerned me at the time that my Danwei, the organization that I was affiliated with, the head of the Foreign Affairs Bureau seemed to know a lot about what it was that I was doing. He just seemed to have his finger on the pulse, and I couldn't figure it out. Was someone following me? Was it, you know, and of course, if you were a foreigner back then in China, it probably was the case that someone was following me. But the interesting thing was this was just the early stages of the internet. The internet was commercialized in 1996, but we were already using the internet in academia in 94, 95. And one time, in looking through my email, I realized that every time I sent out an email, one would go to the person that I was sending it to in the States, and one would go directly to the inbox of the head of the Foreign Affairs Bureau of this organization. And in thinking about this today, it was sort of my first sense of, okay, this whole thing about media is sort of a double-edged sword. There is the ability to make contact with people and the ability to do things independent of government, but it's also, in an Orwellian sense, a great moment for social control. Governments that want to can watch very closely what they're doing. And I remember 2 years ago when I was actually in Beijing during the time of the Tibetan incident, if you will, and I was so frustrated with my television set because it kept blinking in and out. And of course, that's because there was someone in the back room every time CNN was coming on, and every time the word Tibet was mentioned, they would like push a button and say, oh, the screen's going blank, right? And it's these kinds of moments that really make one think about what it is that this entire social media phenomenon, or the issue of controlling information through the social media, and the question of whether or not the government can actually control information, really does become a compelling issue. Of course, there's no time that's more interesting to talk about this than right now, because of what has been happening in the Middle East. Now, the real question, though, is does it matter for China? And so I'm going to try to knit together some ideas about how it might matter in some ways, but how it probably matters a lot less than we think in the long run. So that's going to kind of be my main thesis. And of course, the big issue here is you have the government directing an economy and society in a very aggressive and heavy-handed way on the one hand, and you have a massive population that's very adept at getting around rules on the other hand. Now, I should just say from the outset here, and we can come back to this at the end because I won't spend too much time on it, but I do want to mention some things at the end about it. On the spectrum of people who kind of represent and talk about what's going on in China, I'm often called an apologist for Beijing. I am, if you kind of have a spectrum of people who are on the bullish side, the, who knows, it's, we'll see where it's going to go, and then the House of Cards side, I end up being somewhere over here. I am like off the charts in terms of what I actually believe is happening here. And so I just lay that out there because I'm sure some people in this room will disagree with how bullish I am on these issues, but I'm happy to engage with the conversation about them. Now, to get into the digital space and the social media issues, as I mentioned, I'm not the brains on the digital side of things. I am the China guy and the public sector organizations guy. I work with an individual who's a former colleague at the Stern School of Business named Scott Galloway. He's a professor of marketing at Stern, a true visionary in the digital space. He actually founded a company that I'm sure many of you know of called Red Envelope. Way back when, took it public, has had multiple successes in this area, became a professor of marketing, and just recently founded an organization called the Luxury Lab Think Tank, which has branded a way of thinking about what organizations do by analyzing their digital IQ. And I won't go too much into the methodology of how we've done that, but he linked up with me because he started to say, I need your help in two areas. We need to roll this digital IQ out to China and understand its impact on Chinese organizations and the commercial aspects of this. And we need to do this in places like Washington, D.C., because we should know how these things matter in the public space. So in collaboration with Scott and Maureen, I've done 3 different studies with them. One was on luxury brands in China, and each of these are available on the web. If you just Google Luxury Lab Think Tanks, we give these away. So you can find the Luxury Lab, the luxury brands in China one. Then we did one on the U.S. Senate, which I'll talk a little bit about as well, and then we did one on the public sector. Now what I'd like to do is just walk through some of the highlights of each of these and kind of bring that together to think about what the implications are for what we're talking about here. By the way, I should just mention also that we're going to have time to have questions at the end, but I have spent enough time as a professor in a business school that I'm quite used to being interrupted, and so if you want to interrupt me and go off on some tangent, I'm happy to engage in a more dialogue approach to this. So China. Many images of China, right? You can think about it in any number of ways that are popular and historic images. I like to think about 4 key moments that have defined historically where we are today. The first one, of course, is the classic 1972 moment where East really meets West after 30 years of seclusion and the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And this was, of course, Nixon's real visionary moment. And, of course, the world then shifted again by the ultimate pragmatist and true architect of the brilliant economic reforms that have really, in my mind, completely changed the face of economic thinking in the world today, when Deng Xiaoping visited Jimmy Carter in 1979. More recently, in 2001, the world shifted again. For those who were in the China game at that point, whether you were a consultant or just monitoring what businesses were doing, that accession to the WTO completely changed the game. And within 8 years, we see the greatest coming out party the world has ever known with the Beijing Olympics. But this is also, of course, what I think of as the 4th moment, the social media moment. Right? This is the time when major institutions within countries, both on the commercial and public sector, are fundamentally having the foundations of how they understand public interaction shifting under their feet. Make no mistake about this moment. So I'm going to talk to you as a sociologist for a second. This moment is not just about a surface level transformation in which kids are hanging out on Facebook and learning a different type of social interaction. In industry after industry, for those who are in PR and advertising, you know that your industries have been in some ways eviscerated over the last 2 or 3 years, and it's not just because companies are cutting costs. It is because the very way of doing business in advertising has fundamentally shifted, and it's shifted for good. Right? If you think about it in B2B commerce, it's taken a while for the internet to really shake out what the implications are, but here again, the consequences have been fundamental. If you think about Facebook, Scott Galloway, by the way, when we do events in the United States, I always put these events on my Dean's blog. And so if you're interested in hearing someone who really knows about this stuff and knows the true implications of Facebook for the business world, he's much better at talking about it than I am. But here again, make no mistake about this. This isn't a playground for kids. This will be the largest force on the internet in the next 20 years. And so people often debate this issue and they talk about, well, you know, there was MySpace before there was Facebook, and these things all go in cyclical patterns. Facebook is the only presence on the internet in which time spent and traffic are increasing in dramatic ways. Scott's opinion, and again, he knows this stuff better than I do, but his view is that the valuation of Facebook by Goldman Sachs at $50 billion was by far an undervalued bid. And the reason is because it may be the case that Facebook becomes the internet. There is a very interesting argument for the fact that if you don't have a digital strategy that understands this, and I hear this from my PR people in the business school all the time. If we don't have a digital strategy that understands how to capture the ways in which the next generation of people are interacting with technology, whether it's through education, or whether it's through my talks, or whether it's through the way all of our administrators interact with people, we're screwed. All right? And so there is just, in case after case, we have to really strive to understand this moment. So what did Scott and I do to try to think about that? Our first collaboration, as I mentioned, was in luxury brands in China. And we started to think about what the digital IQ of organizations that were investing in China were, because there is a very simple value proposition here. You can basically get a strategic positioning only half right throughout the world, but if you nail China, you're going to be fine. Let's look at General Motors. General Motors wasn't saved by the bailout. General Motors was saved because their China business is doing better than every other part of their business in the world. Intel has moved the vast majority of its global operations to be operating in sync with its Chengdu operations. IBM, the same. Talk to people like Pepsi and understand what their logistics management has brought to them because of their China operations. It's just in case after case after case, the ways in which this market works is actually buoying the world economy in ways that we truly underestimate and underappreciate. Now, the digital space of course, then becomes very interesting because the value proposition of digital is amazing. It used to be the case that companies would spend, if you're a large Fortune 500 products company, you're probably spending $500 million on advertising over the course of a couple of years. That number can be reduced to sometimes in the $15 to $20 million space by focusing on digital, right? And your value for that investment, your return on that investment can be so much greater. Right, so we looked at what luxury brands were doing in China. Again, I won't spend too much time talking about the details of that because they're in the report, but I just want to mention a couple of things that come out. The digital space, if you get the digital IQ piece of it right, the numbers are just astounding. China already has more people on the internet than anywhere else in the world, right? And the projection 4 or 5 years out is that those numbers are going to be triple what they are in the of the entire U.S. population, right? Similarly, if you look at where that value is going to come from in terms of the largest luxury markets, China not only has more people online, but it has a much younger segment of the population online, right? So if you look at that proportion, it's about double or triple the amount in terms of the younger age group, the 18 to 44 age group, than anywhere else, right? Now, if you also look at the projected growth in e-commerce, the numbers are, again, off the charts. And of course, one of the amazing ironies of being a late developing nation is that because China couldn't waste time laying hard lines for phones, the mobile revolution, and this is true also of India and other places in Africa as well, the mobile revolution has taken off so much more dramatically there because people don't even rely on hardline phones, right? So the numbers then become astounding. There are big winners and big losers in this space, and it's just interesting to kind of really assess. And again, our methodology is not perfect on this, and it can always be tweaked, but based on the way we look at these, and we look at 4 different aspects of the digital IQ, there are big winners and losers that really give you a sense that many, many companies are not thinking deeply about how to have an advanced digital strategy for China. Now, there's one piece that came out of that study that I just want to mention as a caveat here because it's a big hobby horse of mine. I'm sorry to say this to those who live in Shanghai and love Shanghai. I myself count myself among those who love Shanghai. But the action in China today is not in Shanghai and Beijing. The action in China today is in the second-tier cities where entrepreneurial governments are being incredibly creative about attracting capital and putting together deals that are really shaping the global economy. It should be noted and processed that companies like Chengdu have completely shut down their Shanghai operations and moved, like Intel, have completely shut down their Shanghai operations and moved to Chengdu. And when you go and talk to governments and foreign investors in places like Chengdu, Suzhou, Xi'an, Dalian, this is really where the action is. It turns out to be the case that there's a big opportunity for penetrating that market as well within the digital space because there's still a lot of misunderstanding about how that world works. Now let me jump into the public sector part of this because this is where the conversation gets really interesting. So I apologize for the kind of lumpiness or chunkiness of this discussion, but I wanted to give the sort of overview of our digital IQ of China piece. Now I want to talk a little bit about public sector organizations and try to knit them back together and show a coherent story. So we next tackled the public sector organization that seemed like the most interesting or exciting to understand when you think about, is the digital revolution having implications for democracy? And here again, if you make the argument that in the commercial space, the digital revolution is fundamental. This is a fundamental shift that is going to matter for the long term in terms of how companies do business. It is also true in the public space. And this is not just a question of whether or not people have Twitter accounts. It is a question of the very institution and structure of democracy. This is a very, very radically transforming moment. And we saw the beginning of that transforming moment with Barack Obama himself. He is largely regarded as the first digital president, at least of the United States, because he actually figured out a way to capture the individual voter at a much lower price point than the PACs and the wealthy people they could put into monies, into campaigns, had done up until that point. He broke the stranglehold of the political action committees on electoral processes. He reached into the younger generation, but he, more importantly, reached into the individual donor. And this was through a digital IQ strategy. Now, the interesting thing about this now is that although Obama led that revolution, he has been completely outdone by the Republican Party since then. So basically, this was a very interesting moment to think about, because John McCain was famous for having said during the elections, "I don't do Twitter." Right? I don't do that. If you look at what has happened today, though, these individuals have completely captured the political conversation by aggressively embedding themselves in the digital space. This is not a passing trend. This is a fundamental shift that, again, elected Obama first and foremost, but was lost by the White House because the White House is not nearly as nimble as individuals are and their own offices are in the digital space. So let me give you a couple of examples of how this works that are really transformative. The most interesting person, of course, now John McCain has a huge Twitter following, a huge Facebook following. It's interesting that he's revamped his career so quickly by really adapting to what he got wrong in the 2008 election. But he's not the most interesting case. The most interesting case are people like Jim DeMint. So Jim DeMint has about 42,000 followers on Twitter. But as some of you know, if you tweet, one of the phenomenon, the aspects of Twitter, of the Twitter phenomenon, yeah. Okay, Jim DeMint is the leader of the Tea Party, right? I mean, he's the unofficial leader of the Tea Party, right? So this is a guy who is, in my opinion, in such a fight, such a battle with the Barack Obama administration, that it is putting our entire economy at risk because of the partisanship that's happening in Washington right now. Jim DeMint was somebody who was a completely unknown, underfunded, not powerful politician before 2008. How did he become so powerful within 2 years? The way he became so powerful is that on Twitter, if you follow people, you tend to get about a 50% follower back proportion, right? So there's something that's actually very strategic that you can do with Twitter that really changes your profile in terms of how many people think about what you say every day. So Jim DeMint has an army of people that work in his office that follow millions of people, right? Now, they follow millions of people, and they don't get a followership back of 50%, but they get a significant enough follower back that he is by far, nobody is like John McCain on Twitter, but Jim DeMint has his message out on the digital airwaves much more aggressively than anybody else. And so there's a very, very clear strategic positioning here that allows for people to strategically manipulate the digital space and ultimately then really it has implications for the democratic system, right? People are then encroaching on or thinking about it, and encroaching is not the right word because there is a very good story here, right? In a democracy like the United States, this is maybe the most functional thing that's going on in that democratic. We have a lot of dysfunctional things happening in the U.S. democracy right now, by the way. But this is one of the things that's going on because it is breaking the stranglehold of the lobbyists and of the political action committees. It is basically popularizing the conversation in some fundamental way. We then took this set of questions once again and said, but what does this mean for public organization? What does this mean for institutions that are a part of the public sphere? So we did a third study that looked at the digital IQ of 100 of U.S. governmental advocacy and political and party organizations across a number of different sectors, and tried to figure out who is doing the best at capturing the digital space to, again, completely transform what's actually happening in the digital airwaves, in the political advocacy world of these organizations. Now here again, we had some very interesting results from this that really had an impact on how we thought about what was actually happening here. And again, this is a democratizing moment. This is a moment in which organizations are really shifting where and how the conversation is happening. If you look at an organization like PETA, PETA is the pets. It's the animal advocacy group. I forget what PETA stands for. Treatment of animals, something ethical treatment. Ethical treatment of pets. Yeah, ethical treatment of animals. Very small, very underfunded organization, but they are so much in the public consciousness these days. And if you wonder why, it is because they are masters of the digital domain. And that includes, again, things like what your Facebook presence is like. It includes what your Twitter presence is like. It includes how the structure of your website and how you actually use the pass-through of different web presences. And so if you look at what they're actually doing, they have completely done an end run around their funding problems to capture a part of the political public sphere in ways that have really had implications for this. Of course, our number one organization that I think is the most interesting to talk about here is NASA. NASA is a radically different and interesting organization in this space, a complete leader, what we think of as a genius in the digital space. And it's kind of interesting to think about why. Because here's an organization that built its entire identity on capturing technological advancement. Right? So it's not actually that much of a surprise that this would be an organization that would figure out how to be adept at moving in a new direction when a new opportunity comes. And of course, if we think about the internet itself, it's always useful to remind people that this actually is a governmental organization in its nascent infancy as well. The internet was founded, of course, by the Department of Defense, the DARPA initiative, and it was only commercialized in 1996 after several iterations. And so it's interesting to think about these organizations that are technologically focused and focused on innovation to survive, and then think about how they're doing with respect to their digital IQ. The other organization that is the group of organizations, though, that are the best on average are the armed forces. And that's kind of interesting because it took us a while to try to think about why that was. But we think it's because the armed forces have an interesting combination of command control but distributed leadership. So people are very used to, you can take an issue like we need to get our digital IQ up. We need to think about how to be digitally savvy, and that can be a command and control decision. But then the distributed nature of leadership within the armed forces allows this to actually disseminate out very quickly, and the technology then is adopted very rapidly. Now, let me just shift in my last couple of minutes about why and whether this matters for China. It's interesting, I was just mentioning in the beginning this, the Jasmine Revolution and the ways in which technology has really perhaps shifted or brought about the fall of some regimes. Of course, the earliest case that I can think of with respect to this happened here. Does anyone remember when the first major movement and organization that used cell phones was?
Philippines.
No, it was 1999.
Falun Gong.
Falun Gong. People who think about issues of human rights in China often, think about the fact that Falun Gong, about the repression of Falun Gong. And I always like to remind people, you have to remember, Falun Gong was a legalized organization for the first 7 years of its existence. But 10,000 people silently organized the sit-in by using their text messaging on their cell phone on the 10-year anniversary of the Tiananmen movement. Right? You can't do that. That scared the Chinese government much more deeply than just the existence of Falun Gong itself. Right? And so it's actually interesting to think about the fact that China has been struggling with the issues of technology and the mobilization around technology for a long time. I was talking with some people as we were starting today. So I've come to China fairly often, and I always like to just, every time I get here, get out my laptop and check like what websites can I see and what can't I see. And it's interesting that right now, the grip on the internet seems stronger or worse, or however you want to frame it, than I can remember it being in years. I think it's very clear that the government is quite concerned with what's been happening in the so-called Jasmine Revolution. But let me just talk about a couple of things to put this in context for China, because I actually believe that this issue is not that big of an issue for China right now, because China has been such an interesting and aggressive and, in my opinion, underappreciated model of economic reform that most of these things that it has done, I think, counteract or assuage a lot of the concerns that one would have over the kind of unrest. Because that kind of unrest, the unrest that has happened in the Middle East, is not driven by the internet or by mobile technology. That is the tool for harnessing the unrest because of the lack of jobs. Right? So when you have a population, and what demographers think of as a youth bulge, right? And a vast majority of those people feel disenfranchised by authoritarian, autocratic leadership, and they don't have jobs, and they're destitute. That is a recipe for igniting and just a blow-up of the situation. In China, of course, despite the fact that China is still not a democracy and far from a democracy, the process of transformation here has been more successful than any other transformation from plan to market in the world, hands down, no question. But it's also been a model that has fundamentally shifted our understanding of economics in the global economy. So I want to just mention 4 things here that are really important about this that I think basically offset the question of whether or not digital pressures have as much implication for China as we might think they do. The first is gradualism. The hallmark of China's economic reforms and political reforms, by the way, is gradual reform. Gradualism is a key feature of this transition. It was fundamentally against everything that was the prescriptions of the World Bank and the IMF when that was being rolled out under Joseph Stiglitz and Jeffrey Sachs. But it was so much smarter as a strategy because it allowed for the country to maintain stability and to experiment with different models of institutional reform that then make the kind of unrest that drives the internet type or the digital revolutionary movements that we're seeing around the world just makes them less important. Decentralization and competition. A lot of people have always wondered whether the private versus state sector has been a significant issue in China, and that whether or not China was sort of lying about their lack of privatization, because we know in modern economic theory that you cannot have a viable market economy without privatization. It turns out not to be true. What you do need is localization and competition through that local control. And in China, of course, we have so much interesting institutional innovation that has been a very strong force. We also, of course, have great industry coordination. And this goes back to my own issues about how far behind the U.S. economy is falling, because it is definitely the case that China is speeding ahead in a number of key industries around the world that are not just keeping it relevant economically and keeping it at an 8 or 9% growth rate, but are also making it a major player in areas like renewable energy. China is leading the world in building the industry of renewable energy because it has the foresight as a governmental entity to think about subsidization and cross-industry coordination. Of course, we see this all the time in areas like what we call China Inc. It's a very common, when I have executives in the oil industry, they always complain about how it's so unfair because they can't compete with China Inc. And I always say, why do you say that's unfair? Why are we in the U.S. filing suits with the World Trade Organization for unfair practices in these areas when this is just smart capitalism? And we know this not just from China, but we know it from Singapore too. And so it's very clear that cross-industry planning and cross-industry subsidization is a crucial piece of it that's really offsetting any major concerns. Fourth issue is the very adept way that China has been working to not just attract foreign investment, but to build the partnerships with the private sector in ways that just make the stability of this economic reform process so much more powerful. I would argue, just as a sidebar, that we need to learn this in the United States. We went through this in the 1980s, in which Japan was the economic power of the world and sitting on the largest amount of foreign reserves of the U.S. in the 1980s, and we basically rejected the Japanese reinvestment of that capital back into the United States. We cannot afford to do that now. We are doing it right now because we make claims that these are issues of security and state interests. But how many times? It's one thing to reject Huawei because maybe Huawei has ties to the Chinese military and that's a concern for us in the technical space. Maybe it's another thing to reject CNOOC's bid of Unocal because here's another security issue. But it's ridiculous to extend that to Huaxin Haiyer's attempt to take over Maytag. Right? Are we really so concerned with China owning our washing machines? China actually is putting money on the table, and we're leaving that cash there. And that cash is important for us because it creates jobs. All right? And so, in my mind, we need to. I'm much more concerned with the U.S. side of this equation than I am with the Chinese side of this equation. So, just to recap, it should be very clear, and it's clear to me, even as somebody who's not an expert in the area of social media, that this is a radical transformation. Social media and digital technology are radically transforming commercial worlds, but they are also radically transforming political landscapes, at least in the United States and other places around the world where we can see those revolutions happening. In my view, China will not let it happen. This is not the time that the Chinese leaders are going to let go, and I think they've made that abundantly clear. But the interesting thing there, of course, is that so much of the population has, we won't say been bought off, but is comforted by just how far China has come in terms of delivering wealth to individuals across that political spectrum, but also in terms of lifting 500 million people out of poverty. Right? And so there's just it's an interesting moment that I think as long as Chinese leaders stay focused on the pragmatism of China's growth as an economic and political superpower, I think that there is very little chance that we're going to see the kind of unrest and the harnessing of the digital revolution that we've seen in the Middle East. So those are my comments. I'm happy to take questions and go in any direction you all want to. And I apologize for sort of the lumpy nature of the talk, but I think that